But before we move forward, let's go back, way back. To truly understand what Charles Carpenter did, you need to understand who Charles Carpenter was. And I mean really understand him. This wasn't just some random pilot who got lucky. This was a man built differently from the ground up. Charles Carpenter was born on October 14, 1912, in Edgerton, Missouri. A small town. The population barely touched 500 people. The kind of place where everybody knows everybody, and news travels faster than the mail. His father was a farmer. Wheat, mostly. Some corn. The family wasn't rich, but they weren't poor either. They had land, they had food, and they had values: hard work, self-reliance. Figure it out yourself because nobody's coming to save you. Charles grew up watching his father fix broken equipment with whatever was lying around. Tractors held together with wire and prayers. Plows were repaired with scrap metal from old fences. This mattered. This shaped him, because decades later, when Carpenter was strapping bazookas to a plane that was never meant to carry weapons, he was doing exactly what his father taught him: you work with what you have. You improvise. You make it work. As a kid, Charles was different from the other boys in town. While they were playing baseball and chasing girls, Charles was reading history books, mostly. Biographies of generals and emperors. Stories of battles from centuries ago. He was obsessed with one question: how do the weak defeat the strong? He read about Hannibal crossing the Alps with elephants to surprise Rome. He read about how tiny Greece held off the massive Persian Empire. He read about guerrilla fighters and unconventional tactics and moments where everything should have failed but somehow didn't. He wasn't interested in fair fights. Fair fights are boring. Fair fights go to whoever has more resources. Charles was interested in unfair fights. Fights where one side had every advantage and still lost because the other side did something unexpected. Remember this. It becomes important later. Charles graduated from high school in 1930. Right in the middle of the Great Depression, jobs were scarce. Farms were failing. Young men were leaving small towns in droves, looking for work in cities that didn't have any work to give. But Charles had a plan. He was going to be a teacher. Not because it paid well. It didn't. Teachers during the Depression made barely enough to survive. Some got paid in vegetables because school districts had no money. Charles wanted to teach because he wanted to share what he'd learned. He wanted to stand in front of a classroom and tell young people about Hannibal and Alexander and all the other underdogs who changed history. He enrolled at the University of Illinois. Worked his way through. Took odd jobs. Lived cheap. In 1934, he graduated with a degree in history and a teaching certificate. He got a job at a high school in Moline, Illinois. Industrial town. John Deere tractors were made there. Blue-collar families. Kids who were more interested in shop class than ancient Rome. Charles didn't care. He made history come alive. He told stories instead of reading from textbooks. He acted out battles. He asked questions that made students think. If you were a Roman general facing Hannibal, what would you do differently? Why do you think the Persians lost at Marathon? They had more soldiers, better equipment, and more experience. What went wrong? His students loved him. Not all of them, of course. Some just wanted to graduate and get factory jobs. But the ones who cared, really cared, never forgot Mr. Carpenter. He taught for 7 years. From 1934 to 1941. And then Pearl Harbor happened. December 7, 1941. The Japanese attacked the American Pacific Fleet. 2,403 Americans died. The next day, the United States declared war. Charles Carpenter was 29 years old. He didn't have to enlist. Teachers could get deferments. The country needed educators. Especially as young men left for war. He could have stayed in Moline, kept teaching, and waited for the whole thing to blow over. But that wasn't who Charles Carpenter was. He'd spent his entire adult life studying warriors and battles. He'd analyzed campaigns and strategies and moments of impossible courage. Now there was a real war. The biggest war in human history. And he was supposed to sit in a classroom and read about it in newspapers. No chance. Charles enlisted in January 1942. He volunteered for the Army Air Forces. Now, here's where things get interesting. Charles wasn't a natural pilot. He wasn't some barnstormer who'd been flying since childhood. He'd never even been in an airplane until he started training. But he was determined. And he learned fast. The thing about flight training is that it's as much mental as physical. You need to think in 3 dimensions. You need to stay calm when everything's going wrong. You need to make decisions in seconds that determine whether you live or die. Charles had spent years training his mind to analyze complex situations. All those hours studying battles had taught him to see patterns, anticipate problems, and think strategically. He applied those skills to flying. His instructors noticed something unusual about Cadet Carpenter. He wasn't the smoothest pilot. He didn't have the natural reflexes of some younger trainees. But he understood aircraft in a way that went beyond stick and rudder skills. He thought about the machine. How it worked. What it could do. What it couldn't do. And most importantly, what it might do if you pushed it in ways nobody expected. Charles earned his wings in late 1942. He was assigned to the Liaison Squadron, Observation and Reconnaissance. Not fighters. Not bombers. The small, slow planes that flew over battlefields and reported enemy positions. A lot of pilots would have been disappointed. The glory was in the fighters. The headlines went to bomber crews. Nobody made movies about observation pilots. Charles wasn't disappointed. He was thinking because even as he learned to fly the L for Grasshopper, he was already imagining possibilities. Let me tell you about the L for Grasshopper. This is important because you need to understand just how absurd Carpenter's later modifications were. The L-4 was based on the Piper J-3 Cub, one of the most successful light aircraft ever built. Piper had been making Cubs since 1938, selling them to flight schools, farmers, and weekend hobbyists across America. The military version kept almost everything the same. Same 65 horsepower Continental engine. Same fabric-covered steel tube fuselage. Same tandem seating, pilot in back, observer in front. They added some military equipment. A radio. Slightly different instruments. Olive drab paint instead of the iconic yellow, that was it. The specifications tell the story: wingspan, 35 feet 3 inches. Length, 22 feet 5 inches. Height, 6 feet 8 inches. Empty weight, 730 pounds. Maximum takeoff weight, 1,220 pounds. Engine, Continental O-170-3, producing 65 horsepower. Maximum speed, 85 miles per hour. Cruise speed, 75 miles per hour. Range, 190 miles. Service ceiling, 11,500 feet. Look at those numbers again. Maximum speed 85 miles per hour. A German Messerschmitt Bf 109 could do 385 miles per hour. A Focke-Wulf FW-190 could hit 408. The L-4 was more than 4 times slower than enemy fighters. Empty weight, 730 pounds. A Bf 109 weighed over 6,000 pounds fully loaded. The L-4 was basically a toy compared to real combat aircraft. Engine power, 65 horsepower. German tanks had engines producing 300 to 700 horsepower. The vehicle, the L-4 would eventually hunt, had 10 times its power, and the construction. This is the part that really matters. The fuselage was steel tubing covered in fabric. Not metal fabric. Actual fabric. Cotton, treated with dope to make it taut and somewhat weather-resistant. You could literally poke your finger through the skin of an L-4 if you tried hard enough. The wings were the same. Wooden spars and ribs covered in fabric. Light. Fragile. Absolutely no protection against enemy fire. There was no armor anywhere on the aircraft. The pilot sat in an exposed cockpit with a thin sheet of fabric between him and the outside world. No bulletproof glass. No self-sealing fuel tanks. No protective plating. One well-placed rifle bullet could kill the pilot. A burst of machine gun fire could shred the aircraft into pieces. This was not a combat aircraft. The Army made that very clear in all training and documentation. The L-4 was for observation only. See the enemy, report the enemy, stay away from the enemy. Pilots were specifically instructed never to engage. Charles Carpenter read those instructions, and then he started thinking about how to break them. The journey to Rosie the Rocketeer started with frustration. Carpenter arrived in Europe in early 1944, assigned to support the Third Army under General George Patton. His job was straightforward: fly over the front lines, spot German positions, and radio coordinates back to artillery units. He was good at it. Really good. His history training paid off in unexpected ways. He understood terrain. He could read a landscape and predict where an enemy commander would place troops. He anticipated German movements before they happened. Artillery officers loved working with him. His coordinates were precise. His observations were detailed. He didn't just say, tanks at grid reference whatever. He'd describe how many, what type, which direction they were moving, and what he thought they were planning to do. But Carpenter wasn't satisfied. Every day, he watched German forces maneuvering below him. Tanks, trucks, artillery pieces, soldiers. He saw them. He reported them. And then he had to fly away while Allied forces tried to respond. Sometimes, artillery would hit the targets. Sometimes aircraft would arrive on time. But often, by the time the firepower showed up, the Germans had moved. Carpenter was an observer. A messenger. He found the enemy, told someone else about it, and hoped they could do something. For a man who had spent his life studying decisive action, this felt wrong. He started thinking about what he could do himself. The first experiments were crude. Carpenter acquired some hand grenades. Standard fragmentation grenades are issued to infantry. He started carrying them in his cockpit. When he spotted a good target, a truck convoy, a group of soldiers in the open, he'd fly low and drop grenades out the window. This was insane for several reasons. First, the accuracy was terrible. Dropping a grenade from a moving aircraft at 75 miles per hour and actually hitting something requires either incredible skill or incredible luck. Second, it was dangerous. If Carpenter fumbled a grenade inside the cockpit, he'd blow himself up. The L-4 wasn't exactly spacious. Third, it was completely against orders. Observation pilots were not supposed to carry weapons, much less use them, but nobody stopped him. This is something people don't understand about war. The rules exist, but enforcement is inconsistent. If a tactic works and doesn't cause too many problems, commanders tend to look the other way. Carpenter's grenade attacks didn't accomplish much militarily. He might have killed a few soldiers, damaged a few trucks. Nothing significant, but they proved the concept. The L-4 could be used offensively. It could get close to targets. It could surprise the enemy. Now he just needed better weapons. The breakthrough came when Carpenter encountered the M1 bazooka. The M1 bazooka was America's answer to German armor. A shoulder-fired rocket launcher, it could be carried by a single soldier and fired at tanks from relatively close range. The weapon was simple. A tube, a trigger mechanism, a battery-powered ignition system, and a 2.36-inch rocket. The rocket itself was the key. It used a shaped charge warhead, a cone of explosive designed to focus its energy into a penetrating jet. When the rocket hit armor, the shaped charge burned through the metal. Against lighter vehicles, the bazooka was devastating. Against medium tanks, it was effective. Even against heavy tanks like the Tiger, it could cause damage if you hit the right spot. Infantry loved the bazooka because it gave them a fighting chance against armor. A single soldier could destroy a tank if he got close enough and aimed well. Carpenter loved the bazooka for a different reason. He saw rocket launchers that could be fired electrically. Weapons that didn't require physical strength to aim. Weapons that could theoretically be mounted on something and triggered remotely, like an aircraft. The idea seemed ridiculous at first. Mounting bazookas on an L-4 would require improvised brackets, rewired firing systems, and a complete disregard for aircraft design principles. The plane wasn't built to carry external weapons. It wasn't built to handle the stress of launching rocket. Nobody had tried this before. There were no manuals. No guidelines. No approved modifications. Carpenter decided to try it anyway. He found a maintenance sergeant named Harold, who would become his partner in this insane project. Harold had worked on cars before the war. He understood engines, welding, and creative problem-solving. Carpenter explained what he wanted. Harold thought he was crazy, but Harold also thought it might work. They started scrounging materials, bazooka tubes from ordnance supplies, metal brackets from wrecked vehicles, wire for the electrical systems, switches from aircraft spare parts. Nothing was officially requisitioned. Nothing went through proper channels. They just found what they needed and took it. The first prototype was ugly .2 bazookas mounted under the right wing, held in place with metal straps and welded brackets. The firing wires ran into the cockpit and connected to a simple toggle switch. Carpenter took it up for a test flight. The weight was manageable. The aircraft handled differently, but it still flew. He found an empty field and prepared to fire. First shot, the rocket launched. The plane shuddered but stayed stable. The rocket flew roughly straight and exploded in the field. It worked. Carpenter landed, grinning like a madman. Over the next few weeks, they refined the design. More bazookas. Eventually 6, 3 under each wing. Better mounting brackets. More reliable firing mechanisms. Carpenter practiced constantly. He learned the rocket trajectory. He figured out the best attack angles. He determined how close he needed to be for accurate hits. He also learned the limitations. The rockets weren't accurate beyond a few hundred yards. He'd have to get close, really close, to hit targets reliably. The L-4 couldn't maneuver aggressively after launching. The weight shift from firing affected handling. He needed to plan his escape route before he attacked. And 6 rockets weren't many. Every shot had to count. But Carpenter was ready. He painted the name on his plane, Rosie the Rocketeer. And on a September morning in 1944, he took off looking for trouble. His first combat mission with Rosie was almost anticlimactic. Carpenter flew over the front lines, scanning for targets. The roads were quiet. The Germans had pulled back overnight, and the advancing Americans hadn't caught up yet. He circled for an hour. Nothing. Just as he was about to head back, he spotted movement. 3 German trucks on a country road, moving east. Supply vehicles, probably carrying ammunition or fuel. Not tanks. Not the armored targets he'd imagined, but targets nonetheless. Carpenter pushed the stick forward. He dove from 1,000 feet, coming in from the west with the morning sun behind him. The trucks kept moving. Their drivers hadn't seen him. At 300 yards, he toggled the switch. First rocket away. It shot forward and down, trailing smoke. Carpenter watched it hit the road just ahead of the lead truck. Close, but not a hit. He adjusted, fired again. The second rocket caught the middle truck dead center. The vehicle exploded. It had been carrying fuel. The convoy scattered. Drivers jumped out and ran. The remaining trucks tried to turn around. Carpenter fired 2 more rockets. One missed completely. One hit the road surface and sprayed the third truck with shrapnel. 4 rockets expended. 2 hits, more or less. He decided to save his remaining rockets and headed home. On the ground, he assessed the mission. 1 truck was destroyed. 1 damaged. 2 rockets wasted. Not a spectacular debut. But proof of concept, and the Germans hadn't shot back. They'd been too surprised. That was the key insight. Surprise was everything. German anti-aircraft crews were trained to engage fast-moving fighters and high-altitude bombers. They watched the skies for threats. They listened for engine sounds. But they weren't watching for a slow-moving Piper Cub approaching at treetop level. The first warning they got was rockets hitting their vehicles. By then, Carpenter was already turning away. Over the next few missions, Carpenter refined his tactics. He learned to use terrain. Following rivers and valleys masked his approach. Popping up over ridgelines gave him surprise attack angles. He learned to use the weather. Low clouds provided cover. Mist made him harder to spot. Rain kept German eyes down. He learned to read targets. Convoys in motion were harder to hit than stopped vehicles. Tanks with buttoned hatches were buttoned for a reason, they expected an air attack. Tanks with open hatches weren't expecting anything. And he learned to be patient. Sometimes the right shot wasn't available. Sometimes the Germans were too alert, the terrain too open, the escape route too risky. On those days, Carpenter just observed. He gathered intelligence. He radioed positions. He did his official job. But on the days when everything lined up, clear shot, surprise target, good escape route, he became something else entirely. He became a hunter. The tank kills started accumulating. First verified tank kill, October 1944. Carpenter spotted 2 Panzer IV tanks supporting a German counterattack. They were positioned on a hill, firing at American infantry below. Normal procedure would be to call for air support or artillery. But both would take time. The infantry was taking casualties now. Carpenter made a decision. He dove from behind a tree line, coming in low and fast. The tank crews never saw him until rockets were in the air. The first shot hit the lead tank's turret. The second shot hit the engine deck. The tank didn't explode dramatically like in the movies. But smoke started pouring out. The crew bailed. The second tank started traversing its turret, looking for the threat. Carpenter was already firing. 2 rockets at the second tank. One hit the tracks, immobilizing it. He banked away as machine gun fire erupted from German infantry positions. Bullets punched through his wings fabric, tearing, wood splintering, but nothing critical was hit. He limped home with holes in Rose's skin. Ground crews patched the damage with fabric and dope. The next morning, Carpenter was back in the air. The word spread quickly through American ranks. There was a crazy pilot flying around in a Piper Cub, shooting rockets at German tanks. And he was actually killing them. At first, nobody believed it. Tank kills were serious business. They were tracked, verified, and documented. Every destroyed tank meant something. It meant one less enemy vehicle that could kill American soldiers, and here was this observation pilot claiming kills in an aircraft that wasn't supposed to carry weapons. Officers investigated. They found the wrecks. Burnt-out panzers with holes consistent with bazooka impacts. German crews who had surrendered described attacks from a small aircraft. The kills were real. Suddenly, Charles Carpenter wasn't a joke anymore. He was a phenomenon. Other pilots started asking questions. How did he mount the rockets? What kind of brackets did he use? How did he wire the firing mechanism? Carpenter shared everything. He wasn't trying to keep secrets. He wanted others to try the same thing. A few did, but most didn't have the same success. See, the modifications were only part of the equation. The other part was Carpenter himself, his years of studying military tactics. His understanding of terrain and movement. His patience. His willingness to take calculated risks while avoiding stupid ones. Other pilots would mount rockets on their L4s and then fly straight at German positions. They'd get shot down before firing a single round. Carpenter never flew straight at anything. He circled. He waited. He watched German behavior patterns. He attacked only when he had maximum advantage. One pilot who tried to copy Carpenter's tactics lasted 3 days before getting killed. He'd attacked a German convoy without checking for anti-aircraft guns. There were 2 hidden in the tree line. Carpenter heard about the death. It bothered him, but it didn't stop him. Let me tell you about the mission that made Carpenter famous. November 1944. The Allies were pushing toward Germany, but progress was slow. German resistance was stiffening as they defended their homeland. Carpenter was flying a routine observation mission when he spotted something unusual. A German column. But not just any column, this one was big. Really big. Trucks stretched for over a mile along the road. Fuel tankers. Ammunition carriers. Supply vehicles of every type, and in the middle, providing escort, were 6 tanks. 4 Panzer IVs and 2 of the newer Panther tanks. Panthers were serious business. Better armor than the Panzer IV. Better gun. One of the most effective tanks of the war. Carpenter counted the vehicles. Estimated the supplies. This column was carrying enough material to sustain a German division for a week. If it reached the front lines, American soldiers would die. A lot of them. He radioed for air support. The response came back negative. All available fighters were committed to other operations. Artillery couldn't reach the target. Ground forces were too far away. The column would get through unless Carpenter did something about it. He had 6 rockets. The column had 6 tanks, plus dozens of other vehicles. The math didn't work, but Carpenter wasn't thinking about math. He was thinking about chaos. He climbed to 3,000 feet. High enough to see the entire column. High enough to plan. The road ran through a narrow valley. Hills on both sides. Trees along the ridges. The column had one way in and one way out. Carpenter smiled. He didn't need to destroy 6 tanks. He just needed to block the road. He identified his targets. The lead tank. The rear tank. Block both ends, and the entire column would be trapped. He dropped down, using the hills for cover. The Germans didn't see him. They were focused on the road ahead, watching for ambushes from the ground. Nobody was watching the sky for a Piper Cub. Carpenter came over the ridge at 500 feet, diving toward the lead tank. The Panther was buttoned up. The crew couldn't see him coming. First rocket away. Miss. It hit the road 10 feet in front of the tank. Second rocket. Hit. The rocket struck the Panther's side armor. Now, a bazooka rocket shouldn't penetrate a Panther's side armor. The armor was too thick. The shaped charge wasn't powerful enough, but Carpenter got lucky. The rocket hit a seam between armor plates. The penetration was partial, but enough. Smoke started pouring from the tank. The engine died. The Panther rolled to a stop, blocking half the road. The column behind it started braking. Vehicles are bunched up. Drivers confused. Carpenter was already banking toward the rear. He flew the length of the column at 200 feet. Germans were scrambling. Officers shouting. Machine guns are starting to track him, but he was moving fast for an L4, anyway, and the gunners couldn't get a bead on him. He reached the rear of the column. The last tank was a Panzer IV. Older. Weaker armor. .2 rockets left. Carpenter dove. The first rocket hit the turret. The tank shuddered but kept moving. The second rocket hit the engine deck. Fire erupted. The Panzer IV ground to a halt, flames spreading. Its crew bailed out, running for the ditches. Carpenter pulled up and looked back. The column was stopped. Lead tank disabled. Rear tank burning. A mile of vehicles trapped between them with nowhere to go. He was out of rockets. But he wasn't done. Carpenter flew to the nearest American position and landed in a field. He ran to the command post and reported what he'd found. Within an hour, American artillery had the coordinates. Within 2 hours, P-47 Thunderbolts were overhead. The trapped column was annihilated. Final count, 6 tanks destroyed, over 40 vehicles destroyed or captured, and an estimated 200 German soldiers killed or captured, all because one pilot in a fabric-covered trainer plane decided to block a road. That mission earned Carpenter his first official commendation. Officers who had dismissed him as a lunatic were suddenly paying attention. General Patton himself heard about it. Patton loved aggressive officers. He famously said, "A good plan violently executed now is better than a perfect plan executed next week." Carpenter embodied that philosophy. Patton requested a meeting. The encounter was brief. Patton inspected Rosie the Rocketeer, asked a few questions about the modifications, and nodded approvingly. "Keep killing Germans, Major," Patton said. That was all. But it was enough. From that point on, Carpenter had top cover from the highest levels. Nobody was going to court-martial him for unauthorized modifications. Nobody was going to ground him for taking risks. He had permission to hunt. And hunt he did. December 1944. The Battle of the Bulge. Hitler's last major offensive in the West. German forces smashed through Allied lines in the Ardennes forest. American units were surrounded, cut off and dying. It was chaos. The weather was terrible. Snow, fog, freezing rain. Allied air power, normally the deciding factor, was grounded. German tanks advanced without fear of attack from above. For 2 weeks, the skies were empty. Then the weather broke. On December 23, the clouds parted. The sun came out. An Allied aircraft swarmed into the sky. Carpenter was among them. He took off from a frozen airstrip, Rosie's engine coughing in the cold. The landscape below was white, snow covering everything, broken only by black lines of roads and the dark shapes of destroyed vehicles. The Germans were everywhere. Carpenter had never seen so many targets. Tank columns. Supply convoys. Artillery positions. Troop concentrations. The Luftwaffe was up too, trying to protect the advance. German fighters prowled the skies, looking for Allied aircraft to destroy. A Piper Cub would be easy prey. Carpenter didn't care. He flew low, hugging the terrain. His L-4 was painted white on top now, improvised winter camouflage. From above, he blended with the snow. He found a German supply depot near a village called Rochefort. Trucks are being loaded. Soldiers milling around. A single tank provides security. Carpenter circled once, planning his approach. He came in from the east, out of the rising sun. The tank crew was warming themselves by a fire. They never saw him point 2 rockets. Both hit, the tank exploded. Ammunition cooking off. Secondary explosions are ripping through the depot. Carpenter banked away as chaos erupted below. He didn't go home. He had. Sound of gunfire. An American unit was fighting for its life near a crossroads. German infantry, supported by 2 assault guns, was pressing hard. Assault guns. Not tanks exactly, but armored vehicles with big cannons. Just as deadly to infantry, the Americans were pinned down. They had no anti-tank weapons left. They were about to be overrun. Carpenter dove. He came in so low that soldiers on both sides ducked. Germans and Americans alike thought they were about to be strafed. 2 rockets at the first assault gun. One hit. The vehicle slewed sideways, damaged but not destroyed. 2 rockets at the second assault gun. Direct hit on the thin top armor. The vehicle broke up immediately. Carpenter pulled away. Out of rockets. Out of options, but he'd done enough. The damaged assault gun reversed, its crew shaken. The German infantry, suddenly without armored support, hesitated. The American soldiers counterattacked. When Carpenter landed and heard the full report, he learned that the crossroads had held. The unit he'd helped was part of the 101st Airborne Division, the paratroopers who were making their famous stand at Bastogne Point. One of the officers sent him a bottle of captured German schnapps as a thank you. Carpenter kept that bottle for the rest of the war. The Battle of the Bulge lasted 6 weeks. Carpenter flew nearly every day the weather allowed. His kill count climbed. Tanks. Armored cars. Trucks. Half-tracks. Artillery pieces. He lost count of vehicles destroyed. The official records tried to keep up, but documentation was spotty during the chaos. What the records did capture was the German reaction. Captured documents from January 1945 revealed that German commanders had become obsessed with the rocket engineer, the rocket hunter. Multiple reports described attacks by a small aircraft that appeared without warning, fired rockets with uncanny accuracy, and disappeared before anti-aircraft guns could respond. Some reports were almost plaintive in their frustration. The small aircraft attacks during hours when fighters cannot intercept. It flies too low for effective flak engagement. Traditional countermeasures are ineffective. Soldiers are becoming reluctant to travel by road during daylight hours. Even single vehicles are targeted. Morale is affected. We have lost more vehicles to this single aircraft than to entire squadrons of enemy fighters. This is unacceptable, but we cannot determine how to respond. The bounty on Carpenter's head was real. German intelligence identified Rosie the Rocketeer through reports from frontline units. Descriptions of the aircraft, with its distinctive rocket mounts and nose art, were circulated. Any pilot or anti-aircraft crew that brought down this specific aircraft would receive a cash reward and immediate promotion. The exact amount of the bounty was never confirmed. Estimates ranged from 5,000 to 10,000 Reichsmarks. Carpenter found out about the bounty from captured German documents. He thought it was hilarious, but he didn't change his tactics. Actually, that's not quite true. He became even more aggressive. See, Carpenter understood something about psychology that the Germans didn't account for. The bounty was meant to encourage German forces to target him specifically, to make him a marked man, but it had the opposite effect. Every German soldier now knew about the rocket-armed Piper Cub. They knew it was out there, hunting them. They knew it could appear at any moment. The bounty turned Carpenter into a legend, and legends create fear. Now, whenever German soldiers heard a small aircraft engine, they assumed it was the rocket engager. They dug for cover. They abandoned vehicles. They wasted ammunition shooting at observation planes that weren't even armed. Carpenter had become a psychological weapon. His actual attacks killed dozens, maybe hundreds. But his reputation paralyzed thousands. The winter of 1944 to 1945 was brutal for everyone in Europe. Soldiers on both sides froze. Supplies ran short. Vehicles broke down in the cold. Even aircraft struggled. The L-4's Continental engine wasn't designed for sub-zero temperatures. Starting it required preheating. Oil thickened. Control cables became stiff. Carpenter's ground crew worked miracles keeping Rosie flyable. Harold, the mechanic who had helped build the rocket mounts, became Carpenter's most trusted ally. He scrounged heaters. He found special lubricants. He patched holes and replaced damaged components with whatever materials were available. One day, Carpenter came back with a wing so shot up that it should have collapsed. Harold looked at it, shook his head, and spent all night rebuilding it. The next morning, Rosie was ready to fly. This was the unsung part of Carpenter's success. He wasn't a lone wolf. He had a team. His mechanics kept the aircraft running. His intelligence officers provided target information. His fellow pilots covered for him when he broke rules. Nobody does anything alone. Not even legends. February 1945. The Allies crossed the Rhine River. The German army was collapsing. Soldiers surrendered by the thousands. Units that had fought ferociously now simply gave up, but some units kept fighting. The SS, fanatical troops. Young conscripts who didn't know any better, these units became Carpenter's primary targets. He focused on the holdouts, the German forces that were still killing Americans even as their country crumbled. Point 1 mission stood out. Carpenter was flying near Remagen, where American forces had captured an intact bridge across the Rhine. German forces were desperately trying to destroy the bridge with artillery and air attacks. A German artillery battery had set up in a concealed position about 3 miles from the bridge. Their guns were shelling the crossing, killing American soldiers trying to get across. Normal air assets couldn't find the battery. It was too well hidden. Camouflage netting covered the guns. Trees blocked observation from altitude, but Carpenter could fly lower than normal aircraft. He spent an hour circling the area, gradually narrowing down the location. Smoke from the guns. Slight movement of vehicles. Glints of metal. He found them. The battery was in a ravine, protected on 3 sides by steep slopes. The guns were spaced apart, making them hard to destroy with conventional bombing. Carpenter didn't have enough rockets to destroy the battery himself. But he had a radio. He reported the exact coordinates. He described the positions of each gun. He stayed overhead, marking the target with smoke grenades. American artillery zeroed in. The first salvos went long. Carpenter corrected. The next salvos were on target. Within 30 minutes, the German battery was silenced. The Remagen bridge held for 10 more days, long enough for thousands of American soldiers to cross into Germany. Carpenter didn't get a kill count for that mission. He just got a thank you from the artillery commander. That was enough. March 1945. Germany was dying. Carpenter kept flying. Kept hunting. Kept killing. His methods evolved. He'd started the war as an improviser, strapping bazookas to a trainer plane. By the spring of 1945, he was a specialist. He knew German tactics cold. He could predict where they would position vehicles. He could identify command vehicles by their antennas. He knew which types of trucks carried fuel and which carried ammunition. He became selective. Instead of attacking every target he saw, he focused on high-value targets. Fuel trucks that would strand tank columns. Command vehicles that would leave units leaderless. Ammunition transports that would leave artillery silent. One well-chosen target could have more impact than a dozen random kills. This was the history teacher's brain at work. Always thinking strategically. Always looking for leverage. By April 1945, organized German resistance was ending. Hitler committed suicide on April 30th. The German surrender came on May 8. The war in Europe was over. Carpenter flew his last combat mission on May 7, 1945. A routine observation flight over German territory that was already technically surrendered. He didn't fire any rockets. There was nothing left to shoot at. When he landed, Harold was waiting. "That's it, Major," Harold said. "We're done." Carpenter climbed out of Rosie for the last time. He patted the fuselage. He looked at the rocket mounts, now empty. "Yeah," he said. "I guess we are." The final statistics were compiled after the war. Charles Carpenter was officially credited with destroying 6 tanks, multiple armored cars, and numerous other vehicles. He flew over 200 combat missions. He received the Silver Star, the Bronze Star, and the Air Medal with clusters. 6 tanks doesn't sound like much. Fighter bomber pilots often claimed higher numbers, but the context matters. Carpenter's kills came in an aircraft that cost $3,000 and wasn't designed to carry weapons. His weapons were infantry bazookas that cost about $50 each, total investment for his entire operation. Maybe $5,000. A single German Panzer IV cost about $100,000 to build. A Panther cost more. The supply trucks and armored cars he destroyed added up to hundreds of thousands of dollars in German resources. The return on investment was astronomical, and that doesn't count the psychological impact. The supply convoys that never moved because they were afraid of attack. The tanks that stayed hidden instead of advancing. The soldiers who wasted ammunition shooting at shadows. Carpenter didn't just destroy equipment. He disrupted operations. In military terms, that's often more valuable than the kills themselves, but here's the part that always gets me. After all of this, the combat, the kills, the bounty on his head, the meeting with Patton, Charles Carpenter went home and became a teacher again. He was discharged in late 1945. He returned to Illinois. He got his old job back at the high school in Moline, and he never talked about the war. His students in the late 1940s and 1950s had no idea who their history teacher really was. They saw a middle-aged man with glasses who got excited about ancient Rome. They didn't see the pilot who had terrorized the German army. Carpenter never wrote a memoir. He gave very few interviews. He didn't join veteran organizations or attend reunions. When people asked about his military service, he'd say something like, "I flew a small plane." Nothing special. Nothing special. This is the part that defines Carpenter's character more than anything else. He wasn't fighting for glory. He wasn't fighting for recognition. He wasn't even fighting to prove anything. He was fighting because there was a war, and he could make a difference, and that was enough. When the war ended, he didn't need the attention anymore. He didn't need to be a hero. He was content to go back to his classroom and his books and his quiet life. The man who had killed tanks and earned a bounty on his head spent his final years teaching teenagers about the Peloponnesian War. There's something beautiful about that. And something sad. Charles Carpenter died on October 4, 1966. He was 53 years old. Heart attack. He left behind a wife, children, and hundreds of former students who had no idea how remarkable he was. His aircraft, Rosie the Rocketeer, disappeared. Nobody knows exactly what happened to it. The most likely explanation is that it was scrapped after the war, along with thousands of other L-4s that were no longer needed. Some historians have searched for it. There are rumors that it survived somewhere, unidentified in a private collection or a forgotten hangar, but nothing has ever been confirmed. The plane that terrorized the German army is gone. Only the stories remain. Now, let me tell you about the other pilots. Carpenter wasn't completely alone in his experiments. Other L-4 pilots tried similar modifications, with varying degrees of success. Lieutenant William Martin mounted bazookas on his L-4 in Italy in 1944, several months before Carpenter perfected his system. Martin scored kills against German vehicles but was less systematic in his approach. Captain John Groover experimented with mounting machine guns on observation aircraft. His modifications were less successful because the added weight and vibration made the L-4 difficult to control. Several pilots tried dropping hand grenades, as Carpenter had done early in his experiments. Most found the accuracy too poor to be worthwhile, but none of them achieved Carpenter's results. The difference was methodology. Carpenter approached the problem like the historian he was. He studied. He analyzed. He experimented systematically. He refined his tactics based on results. Other pilots just strapped weapons to their planes and hoped for the best. There's a lesson here about innovation. Having a creative idea isn't enough. The idea is just the starting point. What matters is the execution, the patient, methodical work of making the idea actually function. Carpenter spent weeks perfecting his rocket mounts. He practiced firing runs over empty fields. He analyzed every mission and adjusted his tactics accordingly. That's why he succeeded where others failed. Now let me tell you about the Germans' perspective. We have remarkable documents from German officers who encountered Carpenter's attacks. Their reports reveal a mixture of frustration, fear, and grudging respect. One report from October 1944, at approximately 1,400 hours, the supply column was attacked by a small enemy aircraft. Initial identification suggested a standard reconnaissance plane. We did not engage because such aircraft are unarmed and not considered threats. The aircraft approached to approximately 200 meters and launched rockets. 2 vehicles were destroyed. The aircraft escaped before anti-aircraft guns could respond. Recommend updating threat assessments for all small Allied aircraft. Another report from December 1944, morale among transport units has declined significantly. Drivers refuse to travel during daylight hours without armored escort. Even armored escort provides insufficient protection, as the small aircraft can destroy armored vehicles. Soldiers report anxiety at the sound of any aircraft engine. Several instances of troops abandoning vehicles have been documented. The psychological impact of these attacks exceeds their material damage. A third report from January 1945, efforts to intercept the rocket aircraft have failed. It flies too low for effective anti-aircraft engagement. Fighter aircraft have difficulty engaging due to its slow speed and low altitude. The pilot appears to be exceptionally skilled. He uses terrain for concealment and attacks from unexpected angles. We have identified the specific aircraft by its markings. A bounty has been offered but no claims have been made. This single aircraft has destroyed more vehicles in this sector than entire squadrons of enemy fighters. These reports reveal something important. The Germans understood what was happening. They knew they were being systematically hunted by a single pilot in a modified observation plane, and they couldn't stop him. Their anti-aircraft systems were designed for different threats. Their fighters couldn't engage effectively. Their tactics had no answer for an enemy who could appear at treetop level, strike, and vanish. Carpenter had found a gap in the German defense system, and he exploited it ruthlessly. This is asymmetric warfare in its purest form. The strong assume their strength will prevail. They build systems and tactics and equipment designed to leverage that strength. The weak find gaps. They look for places where strength doesn't apply. They attack where the strong aren't expecting. Carpenter was weak by every conventional measure. His plane was slow, fragile, and tiny. His weapons were improvised. He had no armor, no escort, no support, but he understood the gaps. And he lived inside them. Now, let's zoom out and talk about what this story means, because it's not really about one pilot in one war. It's about something bigger. It's about innovation. The military is famous for doing things the way they've always been done. Traditions are strong. Hierarchies are rigid. Change comes slowly. Carpenter broke those rules. He took a plane designed for one purpose and used it for another. He ignored official doctrine. He improvised weapons from whatever he could find, and he succeeded because he thought differently. This happens in every field, not just warfare. Someone looks at existing tools and sees new possibilities. They ignore the people who say, "That's not what it's for," and experiment anyway. Sometimes they fail. Sometimes they succeed spectacularly. The Wright brothers weren't aircraft engineers. They were bicycle mechanics. The founders of Airbnb weren't hospitality executives. They were designers who couldn't pay rent. Charles Carpenter wasn't a weapons designer. He was a history teacher who happened to fly planes. Outsiders see things differently. They are not bound by how it's done. They ask, "What if?" instead of, "That's impossible." Sometimes the answer to, "What if?" is nothing. The idea doesn't work, but sometimes the answer is Rosie the Rocketeer. There's another lesson here about asymmetry. In any conflict, military, business, personal, there's usually an expected way to compete. The strong play by rules that favor their strength. They have more resources, more experience, more everything. If you play by those rules, you lose. The weak survive by changing the rules. By finding arenas where strength doesn't matter. By being unpredictable. Carpenter couldn't outfight German fighters. He couldn't outgun anti-aircraft batteries. He couldn't outrun anything. So he didn't try. Instead, he went where fighters couldn't follow. He struck where anti-aircraft guns couldn't engage. He used his weaknesses as strengths. His plane was too slow to hit. His altitude was too low to intercept. His appearance was too insignificant to take seriously. Every weakness became an advantage when applied correctly. This is the secret of asymmetric success. Turn your disadvantages into opportunities. Now let me tell you some connected stories. Carpenter wasn't the only creative thinker in World War II. The war produced dozens of improvised weapons and unconventional tactics. The British developed something called the Hedgehog, a forward-throwing anti-submarine weapon that looked ridiculous but was devastatingly effective. Standard depth charges were dropped behind a ship. By the time they sank to submarine depth, the ship had moved away and contact was often lost. The Hedgehog threw small bombs ahead of the ship. The submarine had nowhere to run. It was an ugly weapon. It looked like something a mechanic had bolted together in a garage. But it killed submarines. The Soviets used night bombing raids with ancient biplanes flown by women pilots. The planes were so old that German radar couldn't detect them properly. The pilots would cut their engines, glide silently over targets, and drop bombs before anyone knew they were there. The Germans called them night witches and learned to fear the sound of rustling canvas in the darkness. The Americans developed the Bat, a radar-guided glide bomb that was the ancestor of modern smart weapons. It was unreliable and often missed, but when it worked, it could sink ships without putting pilots in danger. Innovation happened everywhere. People looked at problems and invented solutions. Most solutions failed. Some changed the world. Carpenter's innovation was small in scale. He was one man with one plane. But he represented something larger. He represented the human capacity to look at constraints and see opportunities. To take impossible as a challenge. To try things that experts said couldn't work. That capacity won the war. And it continues to shape the world today. Now, let me give you some technical details about the weapons Carpenter used. The M1 bazooka was developed in 1942 as an anti-tank weapon for infantry. Its design was revolutionary, a simple tube that could launch a shaped charge rocket powerful enough to destroy armored vehicles. The name came from a musical instrument. Bob Burns, a comedian, played a bizarre horn called a bazooka in his act. When soldiers saw the new weapon, they thought it looked similar. The rocket itself was 2.36 inches in diameter. It weighed about 3.5 pounds and could penetrate approximately 3 inches of armor. That doesn't sound like much. German tanks had armor ranging from 50 mm to 80 mm, roughly 2 to 3.5 inches, on their hulls, but armor thickness tells only part of the story. Shaped charges work by focusing explosive energy into a narrow jet. The jet can penetrate armor thicker than the warhead diameter would suggest. Also, tanks aren't uniformly armored. The front is thick. The sides are thinner. The top and rear are thinnest of all. Carpenter attacked from above, hitting the weak spots. Carpenter was doing lean development in 1944 without knowing the terminology. Now let me talk about the psychological dimension of Carpenter's campaign. We've discussed the German fear of the rocket engager. But there's more to unpack here. Fear in warfare is both a weapon and a target. A scared enemy makes mistakes. They hesitate. They waste resources on protection instead of offense. They see threats everywhere. Carpenter understood this intuitively. He didn't just attack vehicles. He attacked confidence. Every German soldier who heard about his exploits became a little more cautious. Every driver who hesitated before starting a truck was time lost for the German war effort. Every commander who diverted resources to anti-aircraft defense was weakening the front line. The cumulative effect was enormous. 6 tanks destroyed doesn't capture the impact. You have to count the attacks that never happened. The advances that stalled. The supplies that didn't arrive because trucks stayed hidden. Carpenter was fighting a cognitive war as much as a kinetic war. This is a lesson that modern military thinkers understand well. Information warfare. Psychological operations. Influence campaigns. The goal isn't just to destroy enemy forces. The goal is to destroy enemy will. A single pilot with creative tactics can do more to undermine morale than a squadron of bombers. The Germans knew this in theory. They had their own psychological warfare programs. They didn't expect to be on the receiving end of psychological warfare from a Piper Cub. That's the final irony of Carpenter's story. The most sophisticated military machine in Europe, the Wehrmacht, with its panzers and Luftwaffe and legendary discipline, was psychologically terrorized by a history teacher in a fabric-covered trainer plane, all because one man refused to accept the limits others set for him. Now let me talk about what happened after the war. Carpenter went home. He taught school. He lived quietly, but his legacy continued in ways he never knew. Military theorists studied his tactics. The concept of using small, cheap aircraft for ground attack evolved through Korea and Vietnam into the modern, light attack doctrine. The A-10 Thunderbolt II, the famous Warthog, is, in some ways, a descendant of Carpenter's philosophy. It's slow. It's ugly. It's built for one purpose, killing tanks. The A-10 has better weapons than bazookas strapped to wings. But the concept is similar. Get low. Get close. Use precision to overcome limitations. Drone warfare owes something to Carpenter as well, the idea of small, cheap aircraft that can loiter over battlefields and strike targets of opportunity. That's what Carpenter was doing, with himself as the drone pilot. Modern drones just removed the human from the cockpit. Even civilian innovation shows traces of Carpenter's approach. Startup founders talk about minimum viable products, the simplest version of an idea that can prove the concept works. Rosie. The Rocketeer was a minimum viable product. Bazookas, brackets, wire, and a switch. Nothing more than necessary. Carpenter proved the concept. Then he refined it. That's how innovation works. Not with massive investments and detailed planning. With quick experiments and constant iteration. Carpenter didn't have Harvard Business School training. He didn't know the terminology. He just did it.